Hello, I am excited that I get to read a story to you guys today, and I hope that this is helpful to you. I know some of you probably didn't have the book, and this way you can read it. I know I don't have access to my public library anymore, and that has been a little bit of a challenge with homeschooling. We rely on our libraries a lot, and probably a lot of you do also. But I am going to read to you this book I do happen to have in my personal library. But for those of you that didn't, I thought it would be helpful if I read it out loud. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the book. This is going to be the first half of this book of Cleopatra. So here's the front of the book, and I'll be reading starting with the preface and the very beginning of the book. I'll do my best to help you guys see the pictures and everything, but sometimes I'll read, sometimes I'll show you pictures. So, Cleopatra. This is the preface. Many people believe that Cleopatra was one of the ancient queens of Egypt, but in fact, she did not live in the days of the pharaohs. When she was born in 69 BC, the pyramids had already been standing for more than 2,500 years. She was not even Egyptian. Cleopatra was Macedonian, Greek, the last of the Ptolemies, a royal line descended from a general of Alexander the Great. Alexander had taken Egypt from the Persians in 331 BC. He founded a new capital there in the Greek style, which he named Alexandria, after himself. When he died only 8 years later, his body was returned to Alexandria for burial. His vast empire was divided up among his generals, and Egypt fell to Ptolemy, who made himself King Ptolemy I. Ptolemy wanted to rule in the style of the ancient pharaohs, so he used their titles and claimed to be a god in human form as they had. He also revived the custom of brother-sister marriages in the royal family. In spite of this effort to identify with Egypt, the Ptolemies remained essentially Greek. It is a telling fact that of all the Ptolemies, only Cleopatra ever bothered to learn the Egyptian language. At that time, Alexandria was said to be the most beautiful city in the world, but it was also a great center for learning. Poets, philosophers, and scientists came from far and wide to study at the museum, the forerunner of our modern universities. It was a physician in Alexandria who discovered the circulation of blood. It was there that Euclid formulated his principles of geometry. And it was an Alexandrian astronomer brought to Rome by Julius Caesar who gave the Egyptian calendar to the West. Cleopatra's capital had the world's finest library and its tallest building, the Pharaoh's Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But for all of Alexandria's grandeur and Egypt's wealth, the real power in the Western world was Rome. Unlike Egypt, ruled by god-kings, Rome had been a republic for almost 500 years. This meant the Roman people were governed by an elected Senate. Rome was a mighty military force, controlling vast territories in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Egypt, which had once conquered other lands, now lived under Roman's shadow. At the time our story opens, Julius Caesar had effective control of Rome and all its provinces. He would soon have titles and authority unmatched in the history of the Republic. Caesar and his successors, Mark Antony and Octavian, saw military conquest as a noble enterprise and dreamed of a world united under Roman rule. Cleopatra had similar goals, but she envisioned a combined empire ruled from Alexandria by the Ptolemies. And she almost succeeded. At the height of her power, Cleopatra rallied the wealth and might of Asia to her cause and made proud Rome tremble. On the next couple pages, there's some maps, and we can see this is a map of what the world looked like in those days and where some of the boundaries were. We don't know exactly. We don't have perfect records of how things were in those days, and there's different people that suggest different boundaries for some of these different countries, but you can get an idea of where things were. And if we look down here, we see it says, hardly anyone lived in this part of Egypt. Most lived on the seacoast along the Nile. So down here, there were not a lot of people there. Caesar and Cleopatra may have sailed up the river this far, okay? But most of the people that lived in Egypt were right here and along the main part, along the coast and along the river. Cleopatra VII was 18 years old when she became Queen of Egypt in the year 51 BC. As was the custom, she ruled together with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10. As was also the custom, Ptolemy became her husband. This was only a formality, though, since he was still a child. The young king was guided by 3 important advisors, since the male was traditionally the chief ruler. These 3 men expected to rule the country in Ptolemy's name. But Cleopatra was strong-willed and ambitious. She longed to return her country to the glory of its earlier years. Perhaps Egypt could even regain the empire it had once had under the warlike pharaoh Thutmose III, 1,400 years before. Cleopatra wanted to accomplish this herself, but Ptolemy's advisors were stronger than the young queen. By the time Cleopatra was 20, they had driven her out of Egypt. Cleopatra was determined to fight for the throne, so she raised an army in Syria and prepared to go to war against her brother. But before the battle could begin, it was interrupted by the arrival in Alexandria of Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. He was pursuing his defeated rival in a Roman civil war. Finding his enemy already dead and Egypt on the verge of a civil war of its own, Caesar moved into the palace and tried to make peace. He sent messages to the 2 rulers, urging them to abandon the battle and return to Alexandria to settle their differences. Ptolemy came, but his advisors were afraid Cleopatra might win Caesar's support, so they had the palace surrounded by soldiers and ordered them to kill the queen if she tried to get in. But Cleopatra thought of a plan. She sailed to Alexandria, anchoring the ship offshore. Then she and a man named Apollodorus took a small boat and entered the harbor at nightfall. Once they were safely ashore, Apollodorus wrapped her up in a roll of bedding, some say it was a rug, and carried her into the palace. He delivered the bedroll to Caesar, who must have been amazed and delighted when it was unrolled to reveal the queen. That evening began one of history's great love stories. Julius Caesar, at 52, was at the height of his career. He was a brilliant, brave, and confident general who had conquered much of Europe. He was probably the most famous and powerful man in the world. Though Cleopatra was only 20 when she met this great man, she was hardly an awestruck girl. In fact, they met as equals, for she too had a brilliant mind and a fine education. She was descended from an ancient royal line and was worshipped as a goddess by her people, and the wealth of the Ptolemies was legendary. It is traditionally believed that Cleopatra dazzled Caesar with her great beauty. Instead, it was the power of her intelligence and personality that drew him to her. According to Plutarch, the charm of her presence was irresistible, and there was an attraction in her person and her talk, together with a peculiar force of character which pervaded her every word and action, and laid all who associated with her under its spell. From that night, these 2 exceptional people lived as man and wife. Caesar had hoped to persuade Ptolemy to settle peacefully with Cleopatra, but it came to war in the end. The next 6 months saw a siege of the palace, the poisoning of its drinking water, the burning of the Egyptian fleet, and battles on sea and land. At last, Ptolemy's army was defeated, and the 15-year-old king drowned in the Nile. Weighed down by his golden armor, Cleopatra was crowned once again as queen, this time sharing the throne with her youngest brother, also named Ptolemy, who ruled as Ptolemy XIV. Though Caesar should have hurried back to Rome, he was eager to see more of Egypt, so Cleopatra planned a cruise up the Nile for him. The royal barge was made ready, and for many luxurious weeks they sailed upriver to view the magnificent remains of 3,000 years of Egyptian culture. This rich and fertile land and the grandeur of its ancient civilization must have stirred such an ambitious man. As powerful as he was, his country was a republic, and he held an elected position. But to be a king, a god, that would be far better. If he were to marry this dazzling queen, between them, they would control most of the known world. As her husband, he would become a divine king. Their child, soon to be born, would rule after him. Cleopatra dreamed the same dream, but in her efforts to attain it, she would sacrifice everything. Caesar was enjoying himself so much that he stayed and stayed. His worried generals finally persuaded him to get back to business. Reluctantly, he left Egypt to tend to matters in Asia Minor, and soon after he returned to Rome. Cleopatra joined him there with their baby son, Ptolemy Caesar, who she called Caesarion. Cleopatra moved into Caesar's country estate, and he often visited her there. This scandalized the people of Rome, for Caesar already had a wife. Soon Roman tongues were wagging about her mountains of baggage, her many servants, and her lavish ways. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when Julius Caesar had a statue made of Cleopatra and placed it in a temple of Venus, thus declaring her to be a goddess, not only in Egypt, but also in Rome. The city buzzed with rumors that Caesar was planning to make himself king with Cleopatra as his queen, and that the capital would be moved to Alexandria. Caesar's behavior certainly supported the rumors. He began to sit on a golden throne in the Senate. He even had a statue of himself placed beside those of the 7 kings of ancient Rome. Those who believed in the Republic were afraid of Caesar's ambition, and so in the spring of the year 44 BC, Brutus and Cassius, 2 men whom Caesar knew and trusted, formed a conspiracy to assassinate him. They were joined by 60 to 80 other senators. The day they chose was March 15th, called the Ides, or Middle Day, of March. On the night of March 14th, Caesar's wife had a terrible dream in which her husband was killed. The next morning, she begged him not to leave the house, for there had been other warnings as well. The most famous was from a soothsayer who had stopped him on the street and whispered, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar hesitated, but the conspirators sent a message urging him to come to the Senate. To make sure he would, they told him that on that day he would be made king of all the Roman provinces. So Julius Caesar went to the Senate. When he arrived, the assassins, made many of them his friends, fell upon Caesar and murdered him. In one stroke, Cleopatra seemed to have lost everything, the man she loved and all her grand hopes. Fearing she might also lose her life, she quickly returned to Egypt. When Caesar's will was read, it made no mention of his son, Caesarion. Instead, it was Octavian, his 18-year-old grandnephew, whom he adopted and made his heir. It soon became clear that Octavian hoped to inherit not only his adoptive father's money and estates, but also his position as the most important man in Rome. For that moment, the position was held by Mark Antony. He was a great general and a statesman who had won the loyalty of the soldiers and the admiration of the Roman people. Antony's position was so strong that he hardly took Octavian seriously. But Octavian proved to be more clever and determined than anyone might have guessed. At last, Antony and Octavian arrived at a compromise. Together with another prominent Roman named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, they sought out the assassins and brought them to justice. Then they agreed to govern the Roman territories together, eventually dividing them 3 ways. Antony took the eastern provinces, Octavian took those in the west, and Lepidus was given Africa. Later, this three-man rule, called a triumvirate, began to break down. Octavian forced Lepidus out and took Africa. The ultimate struggle for supremacy was to be between Antony and Octavian. As soon as Brutus and Cassius were defeated, Antony left Rome and headed east on a military campaign. On the way, he stopped at Tarsus in Cilicia. He then sent a message to Egypt, ordering Cleopatra to meet him there. He had matters he wished to discuss with her. The messenger recommended that she come in all the splendor her art could command. But the queen chose not to answer the summons. Antony sent another message, and yet another. Still, Cleopatra refused to respond. Though she planned to come to Tarsus, she would not be commanded. One afternoon, while Antony was holding court in the marketplace, he began to notice the crowd whispering excitedly and hurrying toward the river. Soon Antony was left alone with his guards. Everyone else had gone to gaze at Cleopatra. Plutarch tells us she came sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with a poop of gold, its purple sails billowing in the wind, while her rowers caressed the water with oars of silver which had dipped in time to the music. The music of the flute, accompanied by pipes and lutes. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed in the character of Venus, while on either side, to complete the picture, stood boys costumed as Cupids, who cooled her with fans. Splendid indeed. Cleopatra captivated Antony just as she had Julius Caesar. This was to be the second and last love of her life.